in the early days, actually, people didn't have so much of a sense of John and Paul. It's very much a two-headed creative team, isn't it? There's not so much of a sense of this is John leading the Beatles or Paul leading the Beatles. This is Beatle music.
I've never seen a band with so many different, completely different temperaments. Like John is so different from Paul. That's why they are so great, because the one was the happy guy, the other one was the more introverted. But funny and quick humor they all had.
When the Beatles arrived in 1962, they both reinvigorated and transformed popular music. They neither sounded nor looked like any other band at the time, and their distinctive music quickly began to dominate the British charts. Yet at the heart of their innovation was one of the most significant songwriting partnerships in 20th century music, that of John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
I don't think people necessarily realised at the time that what made the Beatles pretty much unique, even from the outset, was that they wrote much of their own material. They didn't write it all, and it's very interesting. Their first demo for Decca, they're actually covering songs like Shape of Araby, for heaven's sake. But right from the first single, Let Me Do, P.S. I Love You, two original compositions. And certainly in British pop music, which had the Tin Pan Alley tradition, this was very unusual. You don't need me to tell you when you love me. Will always be together. Please, please, be like I please you.
At the time the Beatles came along, they certainly weren't the first British band who were writing their own material. The Shadows had been there before them. Hank Marvin and Bruce Walsh had written a lot of their songs, and they'd also written songs for Cliff Richard. But even so, they mixed up their material with all sorts of other stuff. And mostly they were writing instrumentals as well. The thing about the Beatles was that they were writing fully fledged pop songs in the tradition of their heroes, like the Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly.
What I think is quite interesting is how little this was commented upon at the time. Even up to and including their period of increasing sophistication with albums like Rubber Soul, there was very little attention paid to them as songwriters. It's really sort of 1966, 67 before you get that sort of highbrow critic likening them to the greatest songwriters since Schubert and so on and so forth. So it was very unusual, but in a way what is as unusual is how little remarked upon it was at the time.
What also went undiscussed for the majority of the Beatles' career was song authorship. Although many of the earliest tracks were written by Lennon and McCartney in a fully collaborative manner, there were exceptions. As the decade progressed, both songwriters began developing distinct individual styles. But even with their first slew of hits, there were tracks that originated from one pen.
As far as the early stuff is concerned, I don't think it's particularly instructive or interesting to know who started what song. Because I think in the early days of the Beatles, what John and Paul basically were serving was Beatle music. And therefore, if they did start a song themselves, they nearly always ranked by the other one, which was then fed into the Beatle machine to become Beatle music. So I think the fact that Paul started Love Me Do when he was 16, or John, started Please Please Me on his own, I think is less interesting than it becomes later on. It's very much a two-headed creative team, isn't it? And I think that manifests itself particularly in the sound of the records. You can hear them. They often sing together, particularly on the big singles. They're singing together. So there's not so much of a sense of this is John leading the Beatles or Paul leading the Beatles. This is Beatle music. Oh, yeah.
tell you something. I think you'll understand. And I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. Oh, please.
I have to say, honestly, in those early songs, like I Want to Hold Your Hand or She Loves You, I can't hear the difference. I mean, it seems to me McCartney and Lennon are each enhancing the other's gifts. Early on, there was so much going on with the Beatles that nobody was thinking about, this is my sensibility, that's your sensibility. We're going to write a song called I Want to Hold Your Hand. We're going to write a song called She Loves You. There's not a lot necessarily that you're going to be fighting over. You're just trying to make that song as good as possible and hope that people like it. That was what's really apparent in those early Beatles songs.
I don't think in the early stages I don't get any sort of glimpse of the sort of songwriters they would become. I think those early tracks, 1962, 1963, there's something about some of them, but I think that's the production as much as anything else. The bareness of Lovely Do is actually quite striking in the context of 1962, I think. But that's Martin.
Always be true, so please love me do.
I think it's a mistake to think of anything that Lennon and McCartney did as songs which somehow exist sort of in the ether or exist on paper. What they are is records, and it's their identity as records, and the whole sort of sound of these things that began to be so important. And right from the start, the influence of George Martin on that is crucial. Put him with another producer, and I don't think we'd be remembering him today.
Despite the unified voice that the Beatles emitted on their early records, the band's history would suggest a far more complex group dynamic. They emerged from an English skiffle group formed in 1956 by John Lennon, called the Quarrymen, their name inspired by the Quarry Bank Grammar School, which both Lennon and the majority of his bandmates attended. In 1957, Paul McCartney was in the audience for a Quarrymen performance at a Garden of Fate and demonstrated his musical prowess to Lennon after the show. 2 years younger than Lennon, McCartney was later asked to join the band and soon became an indispensable member of the group. The following year, George Harrison, 3 years Lennon's junior, also joined the Quarrymen, and despite the various lineup changes that would occur before the group finally altered its name to the Beatles, it remained, in essence, Lennon's band.
I suppose you could say there was some significance in Lennon being the so-called leader of the Quarrymen and the fact that it was his group, only in as much as group dynamics do tend to trail a group throughout their entire existence. I think the one who would have been most affected, apart from Ringo, obviously who wasn't there, would have been George Harrison in terms of the fact that he was the youngest Beatle and always would remain so, and so his status in the group was always subjugated as a result of that. As for McCartney, I think his natural competitive instinct sort of worked to his advantage. I think had he been the leader of the group, it might have been a very different dynamic. I think his aspirational qualities, McCartney's, were helped by the fact that he had somebody to compete against. And I think both Lennon and McCartney so thrived on competition that it was good that they didn't come into it necessarily together, that there was a fight for who was the top dog. Certainly Lennon would have been astute enough and was astute enough to realise straight away that McCartney wasn't just some guy that was going to be completely subjugated by him. I mean, he wanted somebody that could compete with him and make him better, and conversely, McCartney felt the same way.
By the time the band had transformed into the Beatles, this relationship had significantly evolved. McCartney and Lennon were now composing together, and their shared ambition and talent drove the band forward. When the Beatles began their residency in Hamburg in 1960, their lineup had also altered, and this served to further democratise the group. New bassist Stuart Sutcliffe a friend of Lennon's from the Liverpool College of Art, would play a vital role in the band, revolutionising their image and raising their credibility. His presence again confirmed that the Beatles were a unit and not Lennon's backing band.
When you look at it from the outside, you didn't even look for a leader because the band was so great. You know, George was singing, Paul was singing, John was singing. So to the outside, there was no way of telling who the band leader was. In the first place, the very first place, I thought it was Stuart Sutcliffe, because Stuart came first on stage and he had those sunglasses on. He looked stunning, beautiful man. I thought this is the boss. But it wasn't the case. He just went over, plugged his bass in, and started playing. And then you already then bit by bit, you got to know all the people in the band. But you couldn't say. I mean, Pete Best was definitely not the leader of the band.
By the time that they had nationally emerged in 1962, the Beatles were a fully integrated entity, and the dynamic suggested by their origin was of little importance to the public, or seemingly to Lennon himself.
Because the Quarrymen was his band, and Paul joined his band, and then George joined it. There was a sense that somehow the Beatles was his band too. But as far as the public perception went, it wasn't so clear-cut as that. I mean, particularly if you remember that on the first appearance on American TV, on the Ed Sullivan Show, the first tune that the Beatles were seen to be singing was All My Loving, led by Paul.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles! Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Remember I'll always be true.
The first impression that the Americans got of the Beatles was not a John-led group at all. This go-ride bass player was singing this very attractive ditty. And that was the first thing we got from the Beatles, was Paul singing All My Loving. So I think that was very instrumental in establishing Paul as at least an equal partner in the Beatles.
The way everybody perceived them here was they were the Beatles. They all had the same haircuts, and they all looked the same, and they were all cute, and they were all funny. And they all were cute, and they all were funny. And irreverent. That was good. All of them. But I remember reading a piece about the Beatles in Saturday Review in 1963 at the Encyclopedia Company in Chicago where I worked, and saying, these people sounded interesting. Why do they sound interesting? Because one of them, John Lennon, had been to art school. And I was a person who was in the state, interested in being a writer, and I was 22. So, this is my kind of guy. This guy is like me. He's been to art school, and he still likes rock and roll. That was not what I thought, and wasn't true of any of the others. So I was always aware that John Lennon was different. Just because, now we know how many other British rockers at the time went to art school and what art school meant and how it was a different track and all of that stuff. I didn't know anything. Been to art school. That's all I needed to know. Long before there was any question of who wrote what or anything, there was that distinction.
Well, it's one for the money, two for the show. You get ready now.
There were further distinctions too. Although from the start Lennon and McCartney had been united by a shared love of rock and roll, and in particular Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly, they also had various individual influences that would soon become apparent in their songwriting.
Well, John and Paul shared the same influences in the early days in that they both loved, Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Gene Vincent and the Everly Brothers. I think they differed in as much as John had been in the Skiffle group, Lonnie Donegan was a big Skiffle hero, and that kind of took you down into Woody Guthrie and Lead Belly and things like American Blues, which I've never really heard Paul talk a lot about.
If you talk about subtle differences, I think you'd have to say that McCartney had a wider palette of interest than Lennon did. And that may well have come from the fact that Paul had a musician father. Jim McCartney would have introduced him to sort of popular jazz, and McCartney definitely had jazz interests, which would have been a bit too sophisticated probably for Lennon at the time. But probably the most divisive thing, which actually did work to their advantage, was of course McCartney's love of music hall and show tunes and vaudeville, and that manifested itself quite early on in the Beatles in terms of Till There Was You and A Taste of Honey, which modern day critics may look back at and say, oh, this is not Lennon McCartney, this is McCartney, you know, looking back to previous times, as he would later do with When I'm 64, and therefore it's kind of retrogressive in a sense. But on the contrary, those songs were absolutely crucial in establishing the Beatles' early popularity, in as much as it provided them not merely with the classic teenage audience, it reached the mums and dads and gave the Beatles a certain credibility.
There were bells on a hill, but I never heard them ringing. No, I never heard them at all. Till there
なんかでも斉藤さんは面白いよね。なんか維新っぽくもあんま
That
りないですよ。
influence that McCartney had, which Lennon would to a certain extent later deride when he talked of, you know, McCartney's affection for vaudevillian music forms, I think it was very, very important in the early career of the Beatles, and also helped them, you know, as you know, it meant they could do extra numbers on stage and stuff like that, which people knew straight away. I mean, everybody knows the Taste of Honey and some of the Beatles do. It's kind of interesting. It's got a faux sophistication about it. McCartney brought that in, you know, very, very early, and I think it did help the Beatles enormously, and again, you know, probably put a certain degree of pressure on Lennon. You know, that McCartney had that additional tool in his arsenal, that if he wanted to up it in terms of the songwriting, you could use those influences too. And Tin Pan Alley at the time would have greeted that and seen it as a real asset.
By early 1964,
Beatles.
the Beatles were a household name.
Please,
both in the
please
UK and
me,
America,
oh yeah,
with two
like
albums
a
behind
please
them, and a
you.
wealth of hit singles in each
I
year.
don't wanna let my money.
For many, Paul, John, Ringo and George were indistinguishable from each other, more recognisable as a whole than as individuals. Yet as the frontmen on stage from the very beginning, Lennon and McCartney had been the most obvious public face of the band, and even in the early days the two had a noticeably different stage manner.
Paul was always the one who was really happy with the public. He was very forward, he could speak a little German, so he was like, "Hallo, wie geht's?" And he was really doing quite a conversation with the audience. And he was always the frontman for the public. John was always subdued in the background, made little jokes, but internal jokes. He was more making the jokes to George or to Stuart or to Paul, and they had a ball on stage. But he was not the one. Maybe he would just say one title or make a little joke about Germans and say Heil Hitler or something like that. You know, those things he would do.
Although the entire band were seen as irreverent and anarchic, it was John Lennon who began to emerge as the most sarcastic, the most acerbic, and also the least controllable. Whereas McCartney would on stage be the more sober frontman for the audience, Lennon was always unpredictable.
I think rock music, or it was still called pop music in those days, if you remember. Most of the people had made up names, you know, Cliff Richard, Adam Faith, Eddie Fury. You were entirely in the hands of your manager. And indeed, I think Elvis was too. None of that nonsense was Beatles at all. They were always themselves, silly expression. But they just didn't kowtow to any of that nonsense. I think Paul was much more sensible, and I think that John really didn't care. He really didn't give a damn what he said, or who he said it to.
Lennon was naturally, you know, subversive in subtle ways, and he was certainly easily bored in a way that, you know, a child with attention deficit disorder or something would be. And, you know, he could go off. It's amazing he stayed in a suit, for instance, so, you know, he was tameable, but there was obviously the wildness in John Lennon.
The song we'd like to carry on with now is one which we recorded on an LP that we made, and that's English for album, an album that we made. And we'd like you, if you would, to sort of join in and clap your hands, you know, and stamp your feet. Yeah, everybody, just join in all together, okay? All right? The song's called I Saw Her Standing There.
It was there on stage. I mean, you know, famously they're all command performance. What was he going to say to the Queen? I mean, Brian Epstein was very frightened backstage because, I mean, some of the things that Lennon said, I'm going to go out. I mean, was he going to swear on stage? Everybody knew if he did, it would be the end of the Beatles' career.
For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. For the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewellery.
He was still doing those kind of subversive things on stage because he knew with all the screams you couldn't hear them, so he could swear, he could get away with a lot of things. You know, they'd do a taste of honey and he would call it a waste of money, you know, which again is a sort of put down McCartney for doing that cover in the first place. But that was part of the course in the Beatles, and that liver puddling went above people's heads. But I think Lennon always felt that he could get away with it through, you know, the sheer power of his personality.
It was not until 1964, and the release of the soundtrack album A Hard Day's Night, however, that an identifiable difference between the compositions of Lennon and those of McCartney became apparent. The first single from the album, Can't Buy Me Love, written by McCartney, began a new period for the songwriting team. Whereas in the past many tracks had been written through intense collaborative sessions, the pair now began to meet up for regular 3-hour sessions at Lennon's home in Weybridge, adding touches to songs that they had composed privately. Released in March 1964, Can't Buy Me Love was followed by the first A-side that Lennon had composed in this manner, the title track to the album and the theme song for the accompanying film.
At the time, 1964, I can vouch that we didn't notice a difference between John and Paul's contributions to A Hard Day's Night. But as you look back, you think, oh yeah, sure. Can't Buy Me Love is Paul. And as a matter of fact, John really isn't heard to much effect on that song, which is interesting. So it's not like the big early hits where you hear them both. So definitely A Hard Day's Night is an indication of things to come.
That was the first clearly Paul-led Beatles single. I think if you look at From Me to You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, Please Please Me, they're singing together. They're harmonizing, or they're in unison together. And then all of a sudden, Can't Buy Me Love comes along, and Paul has double-tracked his own voice. So this has got Paul underlined. It's a Paul-led Beatles record. And this certainly rattled him. He knew he'd been beaten to, you know, something by the release of this record and the success of it. And he countered pretty quickly with Hard Day's Night, which was, again, John double-tracked. So it was a John-led Beatles record. It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night. I think you sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, I find the things that you do will make me feel alright. A Hard Day's Night, in retrospect, is clearly John. Not only is it him singing, but it's a grittier, not only sound, but lyric.
okay, even if Ringo came up with the expression "A Hard Day's Night" in a throwaway line, the follow-up phrase, "and I've been working like a dog," that's not Paul. That's John.
It makes complete sense to me that "Can't Buy Me Love" is a McCartney song and "Hard Day's Night" is a Lennon song. I mean, "Can't Buy Me Love" was quite clearly at the time a real bouncy pop song. It was very soon, as I recall, covered by Ella Fitzgerald. It was one of the first jazz Beatles covers.
I'll give you all I've got to give if you say you love me too. I may not have a lot to give, but what I've got I'll give to you. Though I don't care too much for money can't buy me love, can't buy me love.
Whereas "Hard Day's Night" is one of the very first Beatles songs that really started to express the world weariness that becomes explicit within the music about those sort of negative feelings that certainly were already clearly on their minds through their banter, especially John's banter. They're very different songs, and I prefer "Hard Day's Night" by quite a bit.
What I think is interesting about those two records, "Can't Buy Me Love" and "Hard Day's Night," which sort of followed on from each other, is I think what we have is an evolving expression of the individual composer's take on the blues, interestingly. Now, "Can't Buy Me Love" is, relatively speaking, a gentler take on the blues. It's a 12-bar blues. The basic form is a 12-bar blues. But the tonality of the melody just incorporates this kind of bluesiness. Now you can hear the blue notes there. They're sort of used as an incidental flowing part of the melody, very McCartney. Whereas when you're talking about Lennon's take on the blues, on "A Hard Day's Night," you've got this sort of thing. There, that blue note there. Feel all very brutal blues thing. He's just unflinchingly bluesy on that. Whereas McCartney's using blue notes in amongst the more flowing melody. Lennon decides to hit those blue notes bang on.
Not only had the process of collaboration altered, but "A Hard Day's Night," the album, also signified another pivotal moment in Lennon and McCartney's songwriting development. It was the first album on which all of the tracks were original compositions, and the majority of these have been penned, at least in their crude form, by Lennon.
"Hard Day's Night" is a terrific album. I mean, there's not a weak song on there. Lyrically, it's still fairly conventional. The least conventional song lyrically is probably the title track. But there's all sorts of
Hard Day's Night とかかっこいいよね。
developments going on there.
The Night of Hard Day じゃ普通の曲だけど。Hard Day's Night って。
come up with
リンゴのギャグがね。
all original songs.
いや、めっちゃかっこいいよね。
And also, in the context of the film. I mean, these pop films in 1964 were classically just complete pot boilers. They were ephemeral, they were cash-in, I mean, think of all those Cliff Richard films, let alone some of the rather grisly films that Elvis Presley made in the early 1960s. They were not intended as lasting works of art. So to come up with this set of songs within the context of what everybody imagined would be a pretty throwaway film that nobody would be watching in 18 months, let alone 18 or more years, was quite extraordinary in many ways.
'64 was almost like the pinnacle of the beat music, I think, so sophisticated beat music, right there in the place, making the search, and all those people were playing in Liverpool. But this is really kind of like the supreme example of how far you can take beat music. So A Hard Day's Night soundtrack, I think it's a brilliant album, and it's pretty much a John-dominated album. I don't know why, but he was sort of in the driving seat. Maybe he wasn't taking too many drugs at that point, or he was on the ball, he was in charge, he was in control, and that's very much a John album.
It's a dangerous and crude analysis to talk of it in terms of to what extent it was Lennon versus McCartney, but I mean, you could almost say that possibly up to 10 of the songs are predominantly Lennon, which is quite a lot. It's also the first album in which it's a full 14-track Lennon-McCartney album, which is extraordinary, not least for the fact that they had to both write it and record it, I think, within a 10-day period. So it's from conception as authorship to completion. So it hardly comes as a surprise that they were stretched to the limits.
Yet despite being stretched, the pair were not struggling to produce new material. And just as Lennon was contributing most heavily to A Hard Day's Night, McCartney was busy developing his own voice outside of the Beatles' machine. Writing tracks for other artists was a skill in itself, and it was one that the pair had been developing over time.
This was a group that, that helped the Rolling Stones had one of their first hits with I Want to Be Your Man. They wrote that for the Rolling Stones. John Lennon had some success with Billy J. Kramer's Do You Want to Know Secret, which is a #1 hit for him, probably less so with the foremost Hello Little Girl. But if you look at McCartney and the stuff he's given away, I think it's very telling that they are very, very distinctively McCartney songs. And it may be that it didn't quite fit the Beatles' context, but there is McCartney has his own voice very strongly, I think, coming through in these songs.
McCartney had been working on his compositions in the house of his high-profile girlfriend, Jane Asher. A film and theatre actress from a highly respectable middle-class family, Asher's brother Peter was making tentative steps towards a career in the music industry, and one of McCartney's first moves outside of the Beatles was to supply both Peter and his performing partner, Gordon Waller, with the track World Without Love. The single was an international hit, and firmly established Peter and Gordon as another distinctive act in the British invasion.
It's not quite standard quality, but it's within a folky kind of tradition, slightly self-conscious, overtly polite almost, with almost a medieval courtly love Elizabethan aspect to it in its politeness, and it fitted very much a public school reading, which of course Peter Asher would have and Gordon Waller would have provided, having come from Westminster School. And I think the story went as because it opens with the line "Please lock me away and don't allow the day." It sounds ornate and courtly in a way that John Lennon might well have laughed at. But nobody was laughing at that song at the time when it went to #1. Does it again with Billy J. Kramer's From a Window, which to me is a terribly underrated McCartney song. Most people don't even mention it, but I think it's a lovely ballad that he has produced there. Again, it's an automatic massive hit, quality written all over it. Would have been a hit for everybody. And I think most famously of all, to my mind, is Cilla Black's It's For You, and that was when Cilla was the hottest act of the year in terms of the girl singer. I mean, she had #1 with Anyone Who Had a Heart and You're My World, and suddenly you've got It's For You, done in Wolves Time. It was later done by Three Dog Night, and done probably by mainstream singers all over the place as well. But it is a fantastic McCartney song. And that would have, I think, fitted the Beatles. I'm surprised he let that one go of all of the three.
Nobody
fantastic melodic touch. He had and still sometimes does have the knack of writing a song that you can hear once and it's stuck in your head for the rest of the day, whether you like it. And that was the thing that other producers looked out for, and so I think that's the reason why Paul's songs were the ones that were picked up later on.
It seems that the Beatles were under this intense pressure, doing albums, such as, for instance, A Hard Day's Night and Blues for Sailors, etc., where they're struggling to get as many songs done in 10 days or 3 months. They still have this surplus of songs of that quality, and McCartney's just given them away.
It's for you. It's for you.
But there you have it, McCartney early on established himself as a distinctive voice, separate from Lennon. And I think he found his voice as a separate singer-songwriter before Lennon did, in many respects.
The band were also beginning to be influenced by their contemporaries, and there was no stronger and more distinctive voice coming from America than that of the young folk singer Bob Dylan. Having emerged in 1962 with an eponymous album mostly featuring inspired cover versions, his follow-up, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, was a groundbreaking record. Released in 1963, it featured 11 original compositions, and the mixture of social and political commentary, lyrical complexity, and unique vocal delivery signaled the arrival of a new and formidable tone. The Beatles had heard the album prior to working on A Hard Day's Night, and its influence was immediately recognizable.
If you listen to the early lyrics of Beatles songs, whether they're lyrics by John or lyrics by Paul, they're actually, I don't know if banal is the word, but they're certainly not very adventurous. They're not even looking to break out of the stockade of Moon and June and so on. There are clever lyrical touches, but by and large, it's a fairly conventional kind of songwriting when it comes to the lyrics. What is interesting, of course, is that John Lennon had this whole other side, which initially comes out in his books. It comes out in his own right, and then the follow-up, A Spaniard in the Works. And it's almost as if, in his early songwriting career, he is quite, I don't know if it's deliberate or whether it's even something he's conscious of at all, but his serious writing is quite separate from his lyric writing for pop songs. And one of the key factors, of course, in bringing those two elements of his writing together is his exposure to Bob Dylan. He apparently didn't hear Dylan until early 1964, when a French DJ gave them a copy of Freewheeling Bob Dylan, which had already been out for over a year by that stage, and he just knocked out with it. I think at this stage, probably less by the protest songs and the notion of making political statements in a song, and more simply by the love songs on Freewheeling Bob Dylan, which are not your Moon in June, Tin Pan Alley love songs. They're clearly deeply personal. And Dylan is singing about his own life and his own relationships, and that was quite new, and that was clearly a revelation to John Lennon.
It rolls and flows all down the bridge. Easy for me if I have hanging on. The land, the way I've never heard it. I'm wondering if she remembers me at all. Many times I've thought and prayed in the darkness of my mind, in the brightness of my day.
It's the Dylan love songs, like Girl from the North Country, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, that initially have the greatest impact on John Lennon. Here is somebody clearly singing about their own life, about their own relationships. I think in that respect, Dylan opened the door for Lennon to write a song like In My Life. I mean, very, very simple title, but possibly something he just would never even have considered doing without the example of Bob Dylan.
The effect of the band's exposure to Dylan, both musically and lyrically, would be traceable across the Beatles' next 3 albums, especially in Lennon's work. And even on the Hard Day's Night soundtrack, this influence could be detected.
You can see the Dylan influence on I Should Have Known Better. Listen to the harmonica on I Should Have Known Better. That's a Dylan harmonica influence, and that comes from listening to the freewheeling Bob Dylan. So that's the first real evidence you'd have in the Beatles' canon of Bob Dylan's influence.
I'm sure that the big impression that Bob Dylan made on John Lennon wasn't actually lyrical itself, it was musical. Right the way through the 60s, Lennon was always saying, I never really listened to his words, you know, it's the sound of the songs that he liked. So it's quite possible that he did pick up on the Dylan harmonica technique. But at the same time, I think he was also trying to echo what Brian Jones and Mick Jagger were doing, playing blues harp. I think he was always a bit jealous that they sounded like R&B harmonica players, and he didn't really. And maybe I should have known better with that sort of halfway house, half Dylan, half Mick Jagger.
スープ探しの旅ですか？
スープに国境はないけど、今の道だ。
It was on the next album, Beatles for Sale, however, that the first evidence of lyrical development and Dylan-esque introspection became apparent. Within the lyrics of Lennon's track I'm a Loser, there was evidence of a compunction and self-doubt that had previously been absent from his work.
I'm a Loser is a key song in John Lennon's development as a songwriter because for the first time he is exposing himself, stripping himself bare. On the surface it's a song about lost love, but it's clearly he's much more than saying I'm a loser in the love stakes. And pop music at that time was, you put a brave face on things, really. I mean, it was all very jolly and lightweight. And if you did have a song about having a broken heart because you've been ditched by some girl, then kind of it was implicit that but don't worry, another one will be along in a minute. So this kind of almost self-excoriation, which you can then trace right through Lennon's writing career to the kind of self-flagellation that is going on with the Plastic Ono band, for example. It really starts here with this song, I'm a Loser.
I'm a loser. I'm a loser. And I'm not what I appear to be. Of all the love I have known, I've lost.
ていうか男性アイドルの原型が全部ビートルズだからさギター持ってないだけ4人とも個性バラバラでプロデューサーがバックに
There's a song on Hard Day's Night, when John talks about I've got a chip on my shoulder that's bigger than my feet, I'll cry instead, that was, he's starting to sort of admit that I'm not the guy you might think I am, which again comes through in I'm a Loser, on the Beatles for Sale album. So he was, rather than kind of promoting himself as this big sort of confident star, he was saying, like, beneath this mask I'm wearing a frown. I assume that kind of attitude had already started, but when he heard Dylan stuff, I mean, that could only encourage that sort of self-exploration.
The personality of John Lennon came through in his music. There was a lot of angst and there was a lot of anger, and John basically had a big chip on his shoulder, and only when he was with his close friends did he ever relax. McCartney used to say that sometimes he'd be
having quite a strong argument with Lennon and all the rapier wit and all this would be coming out, and then suddenly John would pull his glasses down and say, "It's only me," you know. But with most people, he didn't do that. Most people, you just got the rapier wit and and he would just ground people into the ground. And that was mainly, I mean, if it had been anyone else, you would probably have called it rudeness. Just because it was John Lennon, it was his great sense of humour. But basically, John was a very insecure guy, and this showed in his songs.
In addition to certain aspects of Dylan's songwriting, Lennon also took the accoutrements of Dylan's persona and stage act to a degree. I mean, he didn't grow frizzy hair or anything, he kept the mocked-up look, but he did employ the harmonica holder. He'd already incorporated, as I said, the harmonica into, I should have known better, of a Dylan-esque harmonica, but he pointedly has a harmonica holder as in the folk way of the time, which Dylan was the most famous exponent of. And of course he's got the Dylan cap long before Donovan incorporated it into 65. John Lennon had it earlier and abandoned it just in time, I think, right, before he could be labelled as a Dylan imitator.
If there was a notable Dylan influence on Beatles for Sale, with the soundtrack album to their second feature film Help, that influence became all the more apparent, both musically and lyrically.
But once we move into 65, even by the time of Help, things are changing in terms of Dylan's influence. It's definitely more pronounced. You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is the first all-acoustic Beatles song. They've gone from electric to acoustic. That's obviously a tip of the hat to Bob Dylan.
Everywhere people stare, each and every day, I can see them laugh at me, and I hear them say, hey, you've got to hide your love away. Hey, you've got to hide your love away.
Despite the obvious Dylan influences, it was always the Beatles, because they were a rock and roll band. I mean, let's not forget that it took the Byrds to take Dylan's very much folk-oriented songs and create folk rock.
Keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin. There's no telling who that it's naming. 'Cause the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing.
Yeah, in a way, the Beatles are doing something similar. They're taking certain influences from Dylan and welding them to their own rock and roll aesthetic, if you like, and creating a British folk rock, although we never called it that at the time. But it's interesting that the Byrds, who are credited as the creators of folk rock, were also called the American Beatles. I think that all ties together in a quite interesting and revealing way.
The title track
バー
itself
ズもで
had
も
also
好き
been
いいけ
composed
ど
by Lennon
やっぱりなんか
in
しょぼいよね
similar
ビートルズに比べて
Commercial pressures, however, ensured that in its finished
So
state,
you wanna
the
be
song
a rock and
musically
roll
had very little in common with the sparse Dylan sound. Yet Lennon would later suggest that the track was lyrically autobiographical and reflected a very real isolation and despair.
In 1970, when John Lennon spoke to Rolling Stone, big confessional interview, he revealed that for the first time that help was
鈴なり裏の出口あるか
and he was screaming for help in his Fat Elvis period. Now the interesting thing is that Paul McCartney and George Harrison and Ringo Starr, this was completely amazing as far as they were concerned, because all they thought that John had done was written a pop song. He certainly never come into them and said, "Oh my God, I'm feeling miserable. I've written this song about it." So I think he might have been looking back at his own, his former self, and maybe adding extra context that wasn't there at the time.
at the same time, when you have got this icon, this world youth icon, shouting help over a really sort of strident pop song, it must mean something to him, his psyche, to have actually come out and said that. But again, it was the fact it was so smooth, such a brilliant production, such a great pop song, meant that I don't think anybody thought about the lyrics beyond the context of the Beatles' film.
本当ヘルプの歌詞ってすごいよね、ビートルズ。なんか青春明るい曲だけど歌詞は本当にネガティブな感じでさ、すごいよね。不安なんだって曲、ヘルプって本当に助けてって曲だから、すごいよね。改めてビートルズ。曲調はめっちゃ青春爽やかポップスなのね。歌詞本当にすごいよね。世界のアイドルが助けて辛いだからさ。Appreciation being loved. Help me get back on the ground. Won't you please help me?
I think when people are listening to
いや、ヘルプが一番すごいよね。曲調がちょっとでも本当にずれてんの面白いよね。めっちゃ爽やかな曲だ。いまだに新鮮だよね、ヘルプ。
Came to fame as a folk singer and always was treated as a very serious artist, talking about war and death and tragedy and broken love affairs and everything. I mean, this was his stock in trade, and when he did deviate from that, he wasn't really appreciated so well. Whereas with the Beatles, ultimately they began as a pop group, and they were always very conscious of the pop sensibilities that they're reaching people right across the whole world, many of whom don't speak English at all, or barely. They were producing commodities, basically. I mean, they were fully aware of this. I mean, I remember Lennon once criticizing me because I was saying that they were doing something
too commercial, and he was saying, we're the most commercial band on earth, and they were. Even
the trick was to produce really meaningful
lyrics and do interesting things musically, which were really going to twist people's minds around a bit, but do them within a format where they would reach, 10-year-olds living in South Korea or something. I mean,
somebody like them never ever reached that market. I mean, there was very few hit records or anything like that. I mean, he always remained a cult artist ultimately.
While Lennon's approach to lyrics was maturing, and his Dylan fixation was leading him into new musical areas, McCartney continued to hone his craft as a songwriter and melodist. Sat alongside the world-weary title track and the folky You've Got to Hide Your Love Away was perhaps the most significant song in McCartney's entire canon. Yesterday would become a milestone in popular music, and it was arguably the first solo record by any Beatle, written and performed entirely by McCartney, with a string quartet accompaniment.
I wish I could pinpoint what it was that was special about Yesterday. And I don't know, there are various things that it does that are unusual, but actually identifying which one matters is very difficult. I mean, the obvious thing is the difference of line length. I mean, now that's the first line. Then you've got 3 times the length. Now that, you would think, bridge, what else does that? But she said, does that, exactly the same thing. A tiny first line, which is then explored. But there's a difference. Yesterday took off, whereas she said didn't. And I think it's probably... Now that is not the sort of first chord you'd expect to hear. It's slightly dissonant.
まあリアリティショーだからいやヤンキー映画は売れるよね。昔から不良映画人気だからさ。
The song could almost stop. Yeah, that's an end. And then it requires some effort. To
continue on. So I think it's probably that gap that allows you time to think about what was the first word McCartney used? Yeah, it gives you time to let that word sink in, that the tone of the song is set by it. It's not today, it's something in the past, but it's something we're actually going to have to spend a whole song exploring. So there's a sense of nostalgia almost encoded within that first second and a half.
All my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday.
When I first heard Yesterday on the Beatles album, it was the sort of track you thought you'd run down and tell your mum and dad, look, see that camera like proper selves. And, you know, it was just, it was a sort of a classical, almost like a classical song that could have come out of a musical or something like that. But I think it also showed, because, the story that Paul told a lot of times is waking up with a tune in his head, it shows how much music he must have had within him, because I think you can only produce what's been put in you sometimes. And it would be fascinating to know what was in the McCartney household record collection, I think his father must have, must have been musical, obviously musical, and dance and music, and I think somehow, that all kind of mixed together in his subconsciousness and came to him in a dream, as it were.
Why she had to go, I don't know. She would say, I said something, and now I know. Oh, yesterday.
I think on reflection, Paul thinks that Yesterday was about his sort of feelings of losing his mother when he was 14, a very close family. It was a really hard blow to take. But it's a song about loss. It's a song about sort of wanting to go back before that loss and to sort of reinstate things. But it could apply to any situation because he doesn't specify. He doesn't say it's about my mother, he says it's about my girlfriend. It could be about anything. I mean, John criticised him for that. He said it's an incomplete song. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't resolve itself. But actually, I think that's its power, really. It doesn't resolve itself. And everybody thinks, I felt like that. Who hasn't had a yesterday that they would like to return to?
Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. Now I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday.
In retrospect, Yesterday looks like the beginning of Beatles individual performers with
いや成城ダイヤル作りたいの僕は。成城ダイヤルって大島大岡翔平のいやもう成城ダイヤルマジの日記文学の最高傑作だよ。面白すぎるよあれ。その文学界かなんかで連載でね、連載時代から大岡翔平こんなにユーミンとか聞いてんのっていう衝撃の今だと本当ノートみたいなブログみたいな感じだけど若みたいな YMO とかユーミン当時のポップス聞きまくってる
secure they all were within the unit, that they could allow something like that to happen, not feel threatened, and not be bothered. And just let Paul do it and be proud for him and happy. And of course, Lennon got half the royalties, didn't have anything to do with it. I think it's an indication just how strong the group was at that time.
Although the group was strong as a recording unit, socially Lennon and McCartney were now immersed in totally different worlds. Living in a prime location in central London, McCartney was being welcomed into the very exclusive world of his partner Jane Asher, and he began absorbing everything he could from this vibrant cultural environment. Lennon, on the other hand, was now in the third year of his marriage with art college sweetheart Cynthia Powell, and was struggling with a life of sterile domesticity in Wadebridge, Surrey.
I never understood why they moved to Wadebridge. I simply can't to this day understand it. But I suppose that they were sort of 2 in the morning, they'd even go to nightclubs in London and carry on people. But I cannot imagine what it was like that. 3 of them moved to Wadebridge to these stockbroken mansions full of absurd objects. like stuffed bears and things like that. It was a stuffed dog, I think, and there was a pair of crutches. I think George gave John a pair of crutches. They were absolutely daft, these houses. And I think that they were all pretty bored. I think things had come to a slight standstill. And they would, I think they never really knew what time it was. But if you rang up John, he'd say what day is it. He'd no idea what day of the week it was. But they were used to living, all their meal times in Hamburg. They were used to living sort of around the clock. And I think this was a sort of period of acute boredom, really. And John did say that to me. This isn't going to last forever. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to stick it around here much longer.
Despite this social divide, the Beatles' next album, Rubber Soul, was a revelation. And on it, Lennon's isolation was made evident through the track Nowhere Man.
There's a certain Dylan-esque development from I'm a Loser through to Hell, and then we get to Rubber Soul. And, you know, you've got a song like Nowhere Man, which I wonder if that could have existed without Dylan, because it's Lennon using almost an allegorical figure of the concept of the Nowhere Man in itself. But that's a very bitter personal reflection upon the state of his life.
And nowhere man sitting in his nowhere land, making no his nowhere plans for nobody. Doesn't have a point of view, knows that where he's going to isn't big but like you and me. なんていい曲なんだろうね、ノーウェア。歌詞がもうボブ・ディランだね。まるで君は僕じゃないか。ノーウェアマンがかっこいいよね、タイトル。どこでもない男って変な名詞だけど。
But in a way, the Nowhere Man, as well as being a critique of, if you like, straight society, the 9-to-5 humdrum existence of that kind of job, it's operating on another level as well. It's John telling us about himself and really admitting that this is what he has become.
Can you see me? なんてかっこいいんだろうね、ビートルズ。いや、ノーウェアマンがやっぱ一番かっこよくない？歌詞。Listen, you don't know what you're missing. Nowhere man for somebody else and your hand.
What's interesting about Nowhere Man is that
John Lennon wrote that song a bit like as if he was Paul McCartney. He always complained in later years that Paul McCartney would always write stuff about other people if happened to them. And on Nowhere Man, he's writing, he's a real Nowhere Man. He's not singing, I'm a real Nowhere Man. Although, in retrospect, it's pretty obvious that he's talking about himself. He's feeling out of place. He's watching his songwriting partner, Paul McCartney, throw himself into radical counterculture London and mixing with avant-garde filmmakers and musicians and so on. And he's stuck out in the stockbroke about putting on weight and being miserable. So obviously Nowhere Man is about him.
Lennon used to say to McCartney that he was a bit jealous of what he was doing, because he would sometimes call up and ask what had been happening in the US, John hadn't done anything except take some drugs and watch movies. Whereas McCartney had been out doing experimental stuff. Or maybe he'd just been down, something like that. He'd been doing something.
Despite his apparent lack of activity, Lennon was still writing, and Rubber Soul contained perhaps the standout track of his works influenced
やっぱラバーソウルが本当すごいよね。
Norwegian Wood,
全部すごいよね。1曲でいいのに全部14曲全部すごい。
and it would also essentially end.
全部革新的な曲ばっかり。
You've got a more cryptic style in the lyrics, much more clever.
やっぱラバーソウルがマリファナっぽい。
John by this
Revolver
stage
が
totally reconciled this thing of his kind of art school writing in his poetry and books with his style of lyric writing.
Dylan opened those floodgates for it, that you can write anything in a song. And for John Lennon to think, well, that means I can get Lewis Carroll in a song, I can get the Goons in a song, I can throw anything into my lyrics, and it doesn't have to necessarily make sense. And I can use as many puns as I want if I choose to. And people might think this actually works in the context, strangely enough, of the song. And so, it's that wonderful freedom that Dylan allowed them to have.
I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room, isn't it good, Norwegian good. She asked me to stay and she told me to sit anywhere. So I look around and I noticed I was in the chair.
I think with Norwegian Wood, you're looking at a song that's much cleverer, much more cannily put together than anything I've done up to that point. I think part of that is just the listening to intelligent songwriting and realising that I can use words to their full effect. But at the same time, he was also trying to do something very new for him, which was to write about having a real affair with somebody. And he's still married. As far as he's concerned, he was going to be married to Cynthia for the rest of his life. So the last thing he was going to do was hear a song about an affair, he's going to have a divorce. So he had to couch it in very obscure terms and pretend that it was a made-up story like Eleanor Rigby and it happened to somebody else and I just heard about it. I think the combination of Bob Dylan's artistic influence and Lennon's, if you like, moral cowardice for what makes Norwegian Wood such an amazing set of lyrics.
まあアンナさんがトップリーダーじゃない。やっぱ作ってるものを見ても新シリーズだと思うよね。IP を使って新しい同じだけどアップデートしていくっていうまさに新ゴジラみたいな。なんか新作がもう多分受けない気がする。細田見てもう世界観がちょっとずれてやっぱ時間もかかっちゃうから別にリメイクすればいいじゃん。
I mean, you're talking colossal egos here, and Lennon got very paranoid about it. Equally, you had Brian Jones getting very paranoid that Dylan had written Ballad of a Thin Man about him, because he mentions a Mr. Jones. I think it's not Brian Jones at all, but there's a lot of pop star ego paranoia going on circa 1965.
When I was through, I filled up my shoe and brought it to you.
でもやっぱ64年とか65年のさビートルズとかディラン聞くと新しいって感じだもんね。全然違う。それまでのエルビスとかと根本的に違う音楽だもんね。全然違うよやっぱ。新曲が全部キラキラしてるっていう。いややっぱ革新的じゃないビートルズ。ラバーソウルぐらいからもう全然違う音楽だから。ディランもエレキにちょうど変えてくる。フォークから脱してロックやったりエレキになってくる。フォーク時代はやっぱりこう左翼的でその赤旗祭りみたいな感じだけどダサい感じだけど。
The sort of electric messiah that he became. So the relationship between them is complex and convoluted and utterly fascinating.
While Lennon continued to push the band forward artistically, McCartney concentrated further on honing his craft as a composer of classic pop material. On Rubber Soul, he once again produced a track that's melodic construction placed both him and the band leagues ahead of any of their contemporaries. Although this time both Lennon and the rest of the Beatles contributed to both its composition and its execution. Yet Michelle, which went on to win the Grammy Award for Song of the Year, split critics at the time and continues to divide them today. Many now feel that the track demonstrated a superficiality that was entirely absent from Lennon's work.
Michelle, it seems to me, was the song that really defined
そうね、ジョン・レノンにミッシェルかけないね絶対本当になんかフレンチポップスみたいなモダンそう本当にハリウッドポップスみたいな感じ薄っぺらいけどジョン・レノンは絶対作れないね
It was an old student party piece that he used to sing in Code French.
And John remembered it and suggested he got it out of the box for Rubber Soul. He didn't. There was no sense of, you know, Lennon the cynic standing by and saying, "You're not putting that on the bloody album, you can't." He was encouraged to do it, and not only that,
Lennon contributed to the bridge anyway.
they were in it together. And it's beautifully done. It's a beautiful little piece of work. Might not have fitted in with the emerging acid rock culture, you know, but the Beatles were never about that.
Michelle, my girl, these are words that go together well. My Michelle, Michelle, my girl, someday we'll keep on flipping on some.
Michelle adds to you know, the Beatles' eclecticism and the complementarity of their musical styles. I mean, it's ludicrous to suggest that the song is lightweight or that it somehow makes McCartney, limits McCartney in some way. McCartney could have written songs which were musically so-called more sophisticated. How many songwriters could write a song like Michelle? No other pop group of the period writing singles ever came up with anything quite as melodic or in terms of the valleys of Tin Pan Alley. We're talking here on a level of a Burt Bacharach or something. I mean, this is a song that is a standard, and it should never be forgotten that as far as, you know, as far as the Dick Jameses of this world, as far as the British songwriting, you know, publishers are concerned throughout the nation, and as far as probably the general public's concerned, the general public aren't listening to Norwegian Wood and necessarily applauding the Beatles for their innovation at this time. The key song would be Michelle on that record for most mainstream listeners at that time. All the Beatles will have known that, and all of pop music knew it. And McCartney became known as this
だからなんかそのアートとかアートなんか誰でも学べるからビジネスを教えないと何にも回ってないし全部赤字だよ。出版は全部破綻してくるから補助金も出されなくなるよ。少子高齢化になるんだけどもうあと7年で来るのガーッと。いやトヨタが海外移したらもうそのままなくなるよ。トヨタがね結構アートとか投資してくれてんだよ。知らないだろ。
He was a great pop composer. He was an adept. He had the same kind of ear that the Tin Pan Alley Pantheon had.
But furthermore, he understood rock and roll, all big things. Nevertheless, intellectually, I find John's impulses more striking, more inspiring, and finally more astute.
Yet even as both Lennon and McCartney began treading their different musical paths, they were able to fuse these into an album that would mark a turning point in their career.
でも安野さんとか AI 組み合わせていけばいいんじゃない？やだけ早尾は AI 嫌いそう。なんだこれは魂のないとか言う。絶対魂のないが出てる。
Been a rock album like Rubber Soul, and you know, and the way that the early Beatles, late Beatles battle in America at least
It's now settled is to say that Rubber Soul is their greatest record of all time.
That's a very, very common opinion over here. I don't know what it's like. I don't agree, but I sure think it's really good.
I think there's a good argument to say that actually Rubber Soul is the great Beatles album in the sense that they were still a group working the way groups work, as a unit, as a playing unit, as a creative unit. The group performances on Rubber Soul are fantastic, in a way that perhaps they never were again, with perhaps a few exceptions, but as an album, the rhythm section is working like it's never worked before. The grooves on things like Drive My Car and the words, inspired of course by American soul music, but at least they had the chops to work out how it works, get on with it. Drive My Car motivates like something else. It's performances like that make you realise, wait a minute,
McCartney, Lennon, yes, geniuses and all that. The way that group holds together on tracks like Drive My Car is amazing. Ringo's groove is amazing. And you've taken for granted, of course, because he wasn't technically a fantastic drummer, but he had a very, very deep feeling for groove. And he could really work with McCartney and make those things happen. There's a sort of heavy rubber elasticity about the way Drive My Car and the word work on that album.
She said, baby, it's understood. Working for peanuts is all very fine, but I can show you a better time. Baby, you can drive my car. Yes, I'm gonna be a star. Baby, you can drive my car, and maybe I love you.
Beep, 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 yeah. And he even cared about everybody's work. They still cared to hang around and work it and work it and work it and turn it into people music.
Looking back, hindsight is a wonderful thing, of course, but you can make out an argument that Rubber Soul is the moment where the LP takes over from the single as the most important statement and artifact.
Having pushed the boundaries of their original sound to the limit, in the following 5 years, the Beatles would transform into an entirely different kind of band. Lennon and McCartney would continue to ensure that they remained the most important act in the world, yet internally, the divide between them would continue to grow.
I definitely could see them changing very much. It's a normal sort of way things go. First, you are a little band. You even live in the same room. You have community, and everybody's cooking tea for everybody, like a boy group. And then suddenly they have their wives or they have their girlfriends, and things do slowly start going in different directions. And that's only natural. In particular, in this case, because John is so different from Paul that they couldn't possibly be together for a long time.
As a musical partnership, however, they would persevere in developing new sounds and creating new possibilities for popular music. From 1966 onwards, Lennon and McCartney were in uncharted territory.
The two of them were seen very much in the same position. They were really keen on pushing music forward, and they knew that they had the great weight of the Beatles fans and all that money and fame behind them, and that they could basically do anything. They had actually reached that stage that Elvis Presley once was at, where he could release an album with him blowing a lot of wood, and it would be in the top 10. And the same, the Beatles could do anything, and they were simply going to use that. The Beatles just heard us. We finally reached the stage where we can do anything, and my God, we're going to.
いやだから結局ジャッジは残んじゃない、パターンは出してくれるからさ、だからプロデューサーは残んじゃない、みんなプロデューサーになってくる。ディレクターもだからディレクターのあり方が変わっていくと思うよね。ディレクター自体は残ると思う、監督はキュレーションする人が。プロデューサーみんなプロデューサーみたいになってくる。